Hello and welcome to Nathan's Book Club. I am Nathan and I'm going to be telling you about a book that I've read recently. In this case, it is Steelheart by Brandon Sanderson. I don't have a physical copy of this book because I don't own one, and I'm not going to buy one just for this video. But suffice to say, I really like Brandon Sanderson. He is writing some of the best fantasy. This actually isn't fantasy, this is like superhero fiction. But he's writing some of the best fantasy that's being written, in my opinion. Particularly in terms of the epic stuff. He just has a really good handle on description and characters and world building. So, I'm a bit of a fanboy. If we ever get to one of his fantasy books, you'll realise that. But suffice to say, I really enjoyed this book. And before we get into the nitty gritty, in terms of spoilers, I'm not going to spoil anything, but I'm just going to tell you things that either happen in the very early chapters or would be reasonable to tell you, i.e. referencing something, maybe something that happens without kind of spoiling it for you. Later on in the video, I will spoil things, but only once I've warned you about to, and then at the end of the video, there'll be some sort of discussion, so that if you're interested in whether you should read it, just watch the first part and then stop. So, Steelheart. So, what it's about? It's a superhero novel. I don't always think that superhero novels are covered super well. I don't think that if you're going to write a superhero novel, either you're going to kind of do away with all the tropes together and then you're going to realise that the world is a gritty, dark place and rapidly you move away from superheroes entirely, or you kind of end up with this sort of Marvel TV and film universe that we've seen happen where we're trying to get real human beings, but we're also trying to have a really in-depth look at what superheroes are like. And in terms of the novel form of that, perhaps because Marvel haven't, to my knowledge, written that many novels, they almost certainly have, and I probably don't know about it. But I just don't think it's been that well done. I've read a few superhero novels, and because there's not a big back catalogue, and because they can't get them to feel gritty and real enough, they often just feel to me like they either go too superhero-y or too gritty, and they don't end up being very good books for one reason or another. Steelheart really nicely manages to pull that line down the middle, having the overtly humorous, the crazy names, the big personalities. There's this, early on you meet this, they're known as epics in this book, this superhero called Cue-Ball, who is this sort of low-lying henchman bloke. And his ability is that he can shoot a handgun forever without it running out of bullets. And that's just quite whimsical and fun and interesting, and there's lots of stuff like that. But you feel like the characters are real, like you feel like the world's real. The world has really been ripped apart by these superheroes appearing. They do the sort of things that you expect people would do if they suddenly had loads of powers. I mean, Sanderson is a tremendously clever writer, so he's really good at allowing his characters to use their tools to mess around with the world. So I have no idea whether I'm going to, in the case of this video, be able to think of a good example of that. There's a character who can cut things into metal, and there's just some nice we're going to make something out of this metal. It's not just merely an ability to cut stuff. You can also you could make a weapon with it, for instance. So the book starts with just a fantastic opening chapter, and I really would recommend that you read that. It's really fun. Just one of the sort of most gripping opening chapters that I've read in a while. Certainly Sanderson doesn't step back from just the epic nature of what he's writing. What's the novel about? It's like a superhero assassination novel. So our main character, David, joins this group of people who kill superheroes. And so they have to plan a hit on Steelheart, who is the guy who kind of rules the city that they're in. What are the good things about it? The world feels right. As I say, it feels like a world would be if it were ruled by superheroes. It has some really fantastic set pieces and locations. So Steelheart, when he's angry, he turns things into steel. And so we live in an entirely steel version of Chicago. And that just allows every single scene to be interesting because flags are frozen in flight. And Stacks of paper have become steel stacks. So just everything is now steel. And so any room we walk into, there's something interesting to talk about or to think, oh, and then, there's this other epic called Night Wielder, who's now made it dark across the whole city. So it's just this nighttime metal version of Chicago. I think that's a great location. There's good mechanics. So all of the superheroes have mechanics. They all have rules that they follow, even if those are unnatural rules. There are rules nonetheless. And so our characters can try and figure out and understand the world in which they exist. There's new technology, and there's a figuring out aspect of that. I think one of Branson's real strengths, and I've written a kind of essay on this once in the past, which references one of the essays he wrote. And one of the essays he wrote is about the idea that characters need to be able to solve problems, not just merely carry out actions, but solve problems with the tools in the world. So there's some things which can kind of dig through metal, and it's like, oh, well, how can our characters solve problems using these things? At one point, a character, no, I won't say that, I think that's going too far, but it's just some really clever stuff where characters are obviously looking at the world they're in and thinking and making decisions based on that. I think it's got a good plot. I don't think I'm particularly fussy, so that's not necessarily a great thing to tell you, because you might just be like, oh, it's so clear how this is going to end up. I didn't figure it out, but then again, I rarely do, so that's not a great... I mean, I enjoyed it. It's one of my favourite novels, and I've read a lot of novels. I mean, I might end up saying that about every novel I read, so, it's based on how I'm feeling about this, given I finished reading it about 4 days ago, but I definitely would recommend it. So I think it's a very good novel. It's got some good themes. It covers sort of justice and revenge, a humorous take on obsession. The main character is a real obsessive, and we see how that affects him. It's not overly graphic or raunchy, which is a plus in my book. It's not my book. I didn't write it. Sanderson did. See, should have covered that earlier. But yeah, so my opinion is you should read this. I mean, my Kindle's just turned off. You should read it, even if you don't like fantasy. I mean, because it's not really fantasy. I think it probably has a much lower entry bar than lots of things. Tell me what you think if you do. And I just think that Sanderson is really one of the best fantasy writers around. So getting a handle on some of the stuff he writes without it being the kind of deep fantasy stuff, I think is really good. So now, if you haven't read it and you don't want to go any further, stop the video, because after this point, I'm going to, first of all, discuss the plot in case you never want to read it. And then I'm going to have a discussion about the things I liked and the things that I thought were interesting, because that's what I want to do. And if you think that's a dumb thing to have done, then you can tell me. Suffice to say, the plot. So in the opening chapter, David's father gets murdered, and that's the thing which kind of drives him to seek justice against these superheroes. So then he goes, and with these superhero assassins, he realizes they're going to attack one particular superhero. They're called the Reckoners. So he goes there and he sees, and he gets embroiled in that hit, and then he manages to join them, and he meets this character called Megan, and he meets this character called Dr. Phaedrus, who's the kind of leader of this cell. He's a very cool, interesting character. They're going to leave town, but he convinces them that he knows Steelheart's weakness, or he has more information on it. Steelheart's this epic who rules Chicago, or New Cargo as it's called in the book. And so what they end up trying to do is they end up trying to pretend that they are a new rival epic coming to the city, a new rival superhero, so they can draw him out because he's very paranoid and they might be able to kill him. So they go to a weapons dealer to try and get some cool weapons that might convince people that they are a superhero rather than being normal humans. They go out later and they destroy a power station. They capture this electrical epic who powers all of Steelheart's stuff. And then finally there's this big fight at the end, and they kill Steelheart. They try everything out on him, and none of it works. But in the final moments, David realizes that Steelheart can only be killed, and that they know this doesn't feel contrived. They know that every superhero has a weakness. They don't know what Steelheart's is. They've tried all these different things that it could be based on how Steelheart killed David's father. Because David's the only one who's ever seen Steelheart bleed. That's the kind of the opening bit. Anyway, so it turns out David realizes in those final moments that Steelheart can only be killed by someone who doesn't fear him, or only be hurt by someone who doesn't feel him. And so he has this detonator, and the detonator is attached to it's like shaped in the shape of a pen because it was bought in the weapons store. And so he shoves it in the barrel of his gun, and the detonator is for some bombs they're going to try and use to blow up Steelheart. They don't have much hope that will work. But Steelheart has this thing where he kills people with their own guns. So eventually he picks up David's gun to kill him, and then he clicks it, and then he sets off his own explosion because he's the only person who doesn't fear himself, and so he kills himself. So that's like a quick synopsis. I've probably done a terrible job of that. I tried to kind of write it down a bit, but there we go. It's going to sound contrived, but it isn't that contrived. I try to think about the ending and the kind of like, would a detonator and a bullet in a barrel of a gun thing work? I mean, you're probably not concerned about that. That's the sort of thing that I get. But thinking about it, I was like, there really are a lot of elements. The fact that he shoots him with his own gun, that's the thing that Steelheart does. The fact that he can only be killed by someone who doesn't fear him. Those are all a lot of nice plot elements that have been put together. So that final reveal does feel satisfying. As you, first of all, I thought of lots of things that they thought of, but I didn't figure that fear thing out. And so it was a nice reveal to me, and it was enjoyable. So I just thought it was a really great set piece. There are other really good set pieces. The gun dealing scene is really fun. There's a motorbike chase, which is just really cool. There's a real feeling of speed and danger, and they're going through all of these like steel versions of things in our world. So like a shopping center entirely made out of steel. It feels a bit like Mario Kart, I suppose. I didn't think there was enough of the 1920s stuff, because the whole thing is that Steelheart enforces kind of like 1920s and everyone dresses like that. But kind of as soon as that happens in the opening chapter, you don't see any more of that, which I think is a shame because it was just such an interesting and beautiful aesthetic. But I think a really strong idea in a fantasy novel is the world feels more real. It feels bigger than the world you're in. And so I think Sanderson is usually very good at this. Perhaps in this, it did really feel like we were stuck in one city, and it was kind of hard to feel like what the rest of the world felt like that. The sequel kind of encouraged that a bit. But this idea that we have some aspect of the book, this 1920s fashion, which we cover in quite little depth, but therefore it feels like there's more we could discover. That feels, while a little bit unsatisfying, it's sometimes things can be bad in a good way, and that there was more that could have been explored, even though the novel itself was really good, shows just how deep and interesting a world he created. The main character is an actual nerd, which is somebody who, I can never remember whether I'm a geek or a nerd, but whichever one I am, maybe both. Like, as someone who is pretty nerdy, that's quite fun to see this guy who really doesn't understand anything about the world except for his deep desire, his obsession really, to kill superheroes. And at lots of stages, he's really done an awful lot of research, and he's really quite paranoid, and everyone's like, whoa, you are a little bit intense. And as someone who's a bit intense, that was quite fun. In the second book, there's a scene where he gets chatting to some girls, and he's like, yeah, maybe I can chat to these girls, and you're like, oh, is he going to try and go snog them or something? But he's like, and then I'll be able to quiz him about superheroes. And you're like, oh, right. He really, that's just like a good comedic moment. But he's a fun and interesting character, and a lot of them are. We really explore over time the psyche of this Dr. Phaedrus, and that's really interesting. Looking at so to spoil another thing. The things we thought were technology, actually, Dr. Phaedrus, he's an epic. He's leading the team. That's a reveal. And and he can actually gift his powers. So people think it's technology, but it's actually his powers. So then we're looking on the outside at this, like, oh, so he's a good epic, but it turns out that anyone who uses their epic powers basically becomes more and more of a psychopath. And so there's this thing, well, but he's a good one, but sometimes he becomes a real kind of scumbag. He becomes a bit of a psychopath, and he hurts people, and he's mean, because whenever he uses his powers to save people, he becomes worse. And so are epics at all redeemable? And I think that's something that the series as a whole is going to look at. And, you know, one human versus one epic is maybe something that we're building towards a discussion of. If you can save one human or one epic, because these epics are all larger than life, they're all quite attractive, while, you know, in a sort of in a magnetic sense. That's a completely unhelpful thing to say in talking about superheroes, but they have magnetic personalities. You're drawn to them even while they're sort of evil, and so you might be like, well, I'd like one of them to be kept alive rather than just one of these sort of plain vanilla humans. But actually, you know, who's worth more, I think, is something that might get covered, and that's quite interesting. Obviously, there's a whole cosmology. Where did the epics come from? What's going to happen to them? Can the world survive? Now that Steelheart's dead, can they keep New Cargo safe? So those are all interesting things which can be explored. And knowing Sanderson, I think they probably will be. And probably, in my opinion, he's clever enough that he can actually tell a sequel story. If this is Ocean's 11, we know that Ocean's 13 is good, but Ocean's 12 kind of sucks. And there's the hope that, in this case, we've told one story, this kind of superhero assassination story. And I've actually read the second one, though I probably won't review it here, but I won't spoil it here either. But suffice to say, the second one is different. It's a different story. It plays on some of the same things, but it's not just like, can we kill one superhero? Can we kill a different superhero? So, yeah, I think it's got a lot of merit to it. I think particularly the characters and the mechanics are really fun. But as I said in the sort of pre-book discussion, the best thing I think is that it's just a good superhero novel. It does something interesting. It critiques superheroes. It's funny. And it is both bombastic as well as being realistic. And maybe we think about some of the really big superhero franchises that have been good. The Spider-Man, the original franchise, The Dark Knight, Iron Man to some extent. A lot of those, the real strength comes from it being a world that we can believe in, as well as a funny and a world that reminds us of the thing we read or watched as a child. So, if you've enjoyed this, let me know. I'll probably be doing more of these because I read a number of books and I really like talking about them. And, you know, if this is something you'd like to see more of, tell me. And it's been a joy. So have a lovely rest of your day. God bless. Now I've got to turn off the recorder because sometimes I can do things in like a more impressive fashion, but I'm just using the base standard recorder. So